Okay, so very welcome to this research seminar. It's somebody has been here before. That's this makes us happy that you're back. Lukas Meyer. We're going to talk about legitimate expectation and compensation in changing circumstances. And Lukas is the professor of philosophy and head of section for moral and political philosophy at Graz, University of Graz, and did his PhD a little bit while ago in Oxford in '96 under Joe Ross. On already then starting working on intergenerational issues, and of course that's what you're well known for: intergenerational justice, the ethics of climate change, and historical justice. And this paper will connect to that. The floor is yours.
So thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here, and I look very much forward to discussion. The paper is a paper that I co-authored with Santiago Trocone, who is also at the Department of Philosophy at University of Graz. And we found out when I prepared for this talk that there are lots of issues that we still have to dig into deeper. So the presentation also is a presentation that clearly does not answer all the questions in the best way possible. So the structure of the talk is this. I introduce legitimate expectations. I talk about a couple of understandings that one may have about legitimate expectations, practice-based understanding, institutional view, what I've called the complex justice view, and then I introduce the idea of legitimate expectations in transitional processes. Then I come to my first question that I want to address in this paper, namely, when is the state permitted to frustrate legitimate expectations? And the distinction that I'm relying on there is legitimate expectations protected by rights and those not protected by rights. In section 3, then the second question, whether when legitimate expectations are being frustrated, the expectation holder has a claim to compensation. And in the fourth section, I address the issue whether this also holds for no longer legitimate expectations, those who lost their legitimacy owing to changing circumstances. And of course, I have something to say in conclusion. So this is not the first paper that I've been working on when it comes to legitimate expectations. I worked on legitimate expectations with Prane Sanklisha, and Santiago and I also had a previous paper on legitimate expectations. What we argue in these papers is that legitimate expectations are to be taken into account in the course of transition processes. So the idea is that when you want to address the issue, under what conditions the transition should be carried out, and how these transition processes can be fair, legitimate expectations can play an important role. And we do claim in a previous paper, Santiago and I claim that it is justifiable to frustrate legitimate expectations if this is necessary to arrive at a just society.
Just a question and clarification. Legitimate here is a normative concept, not a sociological concept about.
Yeah, I come to that.
Yeah,
I come to that. It is a normative concept, and I'll come to how we understand legitimate here. So the questions I will address in this presentation is when it is justified to frustrate expectations when created under conditions of justice. Conditions of justice I will need to say a bit more about, even if doing so is not necessary to arrive at a just society. And more generally, I will talk about under what circumstances can legitimate expectations formed under conditions of justice be justifiably frustrated during transitional processes, and when should those who see this kind of expectations frustrated be compensated. Now, expectations are predictions about the future. If I buy a plane ticket from Stockholm to Graz that departs tomorrow, at 10 a.m. I expect that when I arrive at the airport tomorrow at 10, I will find the plane that goes to Graz. I also expect the plane to arrive at Graz a few hours later. Given these expectations, I organize my life, taking them into account. Tonight, I will pack things for my travel to Graz. I get up early to make it to the airport on time. I even ask my friend to pick me up when I arrive in Graz, who then plans to meet me at the airport as he expects me to arrive by plane from Stockholm. In addition, my partner, who remained in Graz, makes plans based on the expectation that I will be home tomorrow. This example shows that expectations play an important role in how people organize their lives. However, I'm concerned here in this presentation not with all kinds of expectations, but with legitimate expectations in the context of transitions, particularly when it comes to the transition to a net zero emission society. The challenge then is to explain why the idea of legitimate expectations can be defended beyond cases of interpersonal relationships, such as in this example of me traveling to Graz by plane. Now there is a view that is well known, Rawls' view on legitimate expectations, an institutional view on legitimate expectations. Legitimate expectations means here that you have the expectation of receiving the benefits of the basic structure, and those expectations have been formed against the background of a just basic structure, the just basic structure being the outcome of pure procedural justice. The problem with this understanding of legitimate expectation is that it presupposes that the basic structure is just, and if expectations are legitimate only when formed against the background of a just basic structure, then since we do not live under conditions of justice, no expectation can be considered legitimate. So this understanding of Rawls, ideal understanding of Rawls, won't do. So we came up with a different understanding of legitimate expectations, and according to this, it's a normative understanding. As Gustav pointed out before, legitimate expectations need to be both epistemically and normatively valid. Epistemically valid means here that the expectation goes back to behavior by the relevant agencies, in this context normally state agencies, or state agencies have made communications so that these expectations were formed or could be formed. And justice-based validity means that the legitimate expectations have to comply with certain justice constraints. We distinguish here universalization, consistency, and reasonability. Universalization meaning that when I hold a certain expectation, I have to accept that others in similar circumstances will also hold such expectations. Consistency means that my expectations should be consistent with the wider views I have on justice, and reasonability means that the kind of expectations that I hold should be reasonable by being compatible with plausible views on justice. So we need to then understand how legitimate expectations are related to strategies of transformation, and I do this very quickly, though it's not the topic of this talk. So the idea is that we are constrained in the choices we make when it comes to strategic options, how to bring about transformation by considerations of justice. And each strategic option is likely to be compatible with different sets of legitimate expectations, expectations that are both epistemically and normatively valid. The option to be pursued, the strategic option to be pursued, is chosen on the basis of a procedure, but that is not a perfect procedure, but an imperfect procedure constrained by considerations of justice. And the strategic option that is then chosen can be considered the just option. If that is the understanding that you assume, then you will also have to accept that at least some legitimate expectations can be unjust, a view that also other authors hold, among them Margaret Moore. What does then having a legitimate expectation in the transition mean? Legitimate expectations reflect the legitimate interest in the distributive shares the expectation holder expects to receive when she does her part in the existing arrangements. These expectations are legitimate because they remain within the range of acceptable solutions that the operation of imperfect procedural justice may lead to, even if they have been formed against the background of a basic structure that is not just. Legitimate expectations do not necessarily give us a right to receive the benefits of the basic structure, but they do give us more than a mere interest in it. They give us a legitimate interest in receiving them, as receiving these benefits could be an element of the to be chosen just basic structure in transition. So I come now to the first question that I want to discuss. I've argued that legitimate expectations reflect legitimate interest in receiving the benefits for complying with and performing the activities required by existing public arrangements. Now I'd like to investigate under what conditions, if any, the state is permitted to frustrate those expectations. And I will distinguish here between those legitimate expectations that amount to the protection of rights and those that do not. Gustav mentioned that I was doing my doctorate under the supervision of Joseph Raz, and this will now figure in some of what I'm saying here, right? So human beings want to direct their lives according to their own considerations, which is an expression of the ideal of personal autonomy. The expectation of pursuing autonomously chosen life plans also requires protection. When legitimate expectations are being frustrated, and that undermines the expectation holder's ability to plan, infringes some of her basic moral rights, or imposes an excessive cost on the expectation holder, the expectation holder has a transitional right to a greater share of the benefits available. And the first case, for instance, occurs when new policies or legislative changes are made too frequently or retroactively. The second case takes place when the new regulation may undermine a basic right of the expectation holder unless an exception is granted. And the third case occurs when excessive burdens are placed on the expectation holder, even if neither the ability to plan nor basic rights are necessarily at stake. So the frustration of legitimate expectations, that's the claim that I want to put forward here. Legitimate expectation protected by rights is permissible when necessary to arrive at a just society. No particular, but some legitimate expectations need to be frustrated is being assumed. The state is justified in frustrating particular expectations, provided that it has chosen among the policies in this imperfect procedure, and in doing so limits the options by the following criteria. It minimizes the frustration of those expectations. It compensates those whose expectations need to be frustrated in order to arrive at a just society. And it follows certain priority rules for deciding which group of people might have to be burdened in the transitional process. However, not all legitimate expectations are protected by rights. The range of cases in which the state may justifiably frustrate legitimate expectations, give the expectation holder only a legitimate interest in receiving the benefits of the basic structure, is wider than the range of cases in which the expectation holder also has a transitional right to a greater share of the benefits of the basic structure. Those legitimate expectations that do not concern the protection of rights may be justifiably frustrated, even if this is not necessary to arrive at a just society. This possibility, of course, does not exempt the state from justifying why some of these legitimate expectations will be frustrated. As I argue later, it may even have to compensate the expectation holder in some cases. So suppose my friend who lives in Graz and will pick me up at the airport goes to the Graz State Opera regularly. She can allow herself this enjoyment as tickets are affordable thanks to the subsidies the opera receives from the government. In fact, going to the opera in Austria, to the state operas in Austria, is as expensive as going to a museum in Stockholm. My friend enjoys the opera season and over the years has developed the expectation, let us suppose the legitimate expectation of attending the opera in the years to come. Now, however, the government has decided to redirect subsidies for the Graz State Opera into climate policies aimed at helping Austria achieve net zero emissions. Although the reallocation of cultural subsidies to climate policies is not necessary to reach climate neutrality, such a reallocation may be justified insofar as it increases fairness in the transformation process. For instance, the redirected subsidies are designed to help low and middle income citizens make their homes more energy efficient by improving thermal insulation or installing heating and cooling systems that use renewable resources. Is it morally permissible for the Austrian government to shift subsidies in this way? If the government implements such a policy, your friend's legitimate expectation of going to the opera regularly will be frustrated. Now, I argue that the state is generally justified in frustrating legitimate expectations that reflect only a legitimate interest in continuing to maintain the benefits of the existing basic structure. However, this does not exempt the state from the duty to take measures to ensure that the autonomy of the expectation holder is not unnecessarily impaired. So how can the state minimize the interference with the autonomy of the expectation holder? I proceed from the assumption that human beings are interested in being in part authors of their own lives. In this view, personal autonomy is a value to be protected. As has been argued, for instance, by Joseph Raz, one of the conditions of autonomy is to have an adequate range of options. This may require access to cultural goods, such as going to the opera. However, as Raz also observes, quote, while autonomy requires the availability of an adequate range of options, it does not require the presence of any particular option among them, end of quote. Suppose one accepts that people should have access to cultural goods in order to have an adequate range of options available to them, even though it does not follow that such access enjoyment must be realized by attending opera performances. People can enjoy cultural goods by having access to other kinds of art concerts, museums, films, libraries, or even attending sports matches and tournaments. If some of the options available can serve as a substitute for attending opera performances, then the frustration of my friend's legitimate expectation of attending the opera may not be as severe, since she can still pursue her life plan of enjoying cultural goods and will be able to realize such goods of roughly equal quality. So, to sum up, in the transformation to a net zero emission society, legitimate expectations protected by rights can be justifiably frustrated only if doing so is necessary to arrive at a just society. This is in the first row here, right? The first yes. Those legitimate expectations that are not protected by rights, second row, but reflect a legitimate interest in the benefits of the basic structure, cannot only be justifiably frustrated if this is necessary to arrive at a just society, their frustration can also be justified if the expectation holder has an adequate range of options of roughly equal quality, even if doing so is not necessary to reach a net zero emission society. Finally, third row, since only those expectations that can be considered legitimate have normative weight, the frustration of expectations that are not legitimate can also be justified, even if doing so is not necessary to arrive at a net zero emission society and no alternative options are available. So far, I talked about the conditions under which the state is justified in frustrating legitimate expectations. I now turn to the second question, the question of the conditions under which the frustration of legitimate expectations requires compensation. I start again with legitimate expectations protected by rights. The frustration of legitimate expectations due to the abuse of power, arbitrariness, failure to provide the expectation holder sufficient time to adapt to new circumstances or other kinds of wrongdoings always requires compensatory measures. This is because in these cases the frustration of legitimate expectations is wrongful, and wrongful harms and losses generally call for repair in compensatory justice. However, the frustration of legitimate expectations may also require compensatory measures even when the state is justified in frustrating them, that is, when their frustration is not wrongful. Concerning the transformation to a net zero emission society, it could be argued that it is not clear why the state should compensate if some legitimate expectation is frustrated in achieving such a society. The reason for this objection is that the transformation to a net zero emission society is required by valid justice criteria, even if some agents' legitimate expectations will be frustrated in the process. Therefore, the frustration of some legitimate expectations in this process, even if harmful, cannot be wrongful. Indeed, as long as states have a duty to pursue transformation policies in order to arrive at a net zero emission society, it seems that states have the duty to pursue actions or policies that may lead to the frustration of some legitimate expectations. The question therefore arises as to how it is possible for states to have to pay compensation for behaving in a way that justice demands. If the state is justified in frustrating some legitimate expectations in order to arrive at a net zero emission society, then it seems that no matter how legitimate the frustrated expectations are, the harmful consequences of such actions should not be compensated, since the harm caused is not wrongful. In response to this objection, I contend that even if the state's action is not wrongful, it does not follow that no compensation should be provided. And I think that's the standard argument that is being explained by the famous backpacker case Joel Feinberg presents. So it reads like this in Feinberg: suppose that you are on a backpacking trip in the high mountain country when an unanticipated blizzard strikes the area with such ferocity that your life is imperiled. Fortunately, you stumble onto an unoccupied cabin, locked and boarded up for the winter, clearly somebody else's private property. You smash in a window, enter and huddle in a corner for 3 days until the storm abates. During this period, you help yourself to your unknown benefactor's food supply and burn his wooden furniture in the fireplace to keep warm. In this case, Feinberg claims that you are justified in smashing the window and burning the furniture. But do you owe the cabin owner compensation for the damage you caused? If you owe that person compensation, such compensation does not stem from the fact that the harm you caused that person is wrongful. Since you were justified in breaking into the cabin and burning his wooden furniture, the harm this person has suffered is not wrongful. When conflicting moral considerations override a right, the reasons that justify the existence of such a right do not disappear. They remain in the background waiting for conformity. If these reasons were important enough for holding others under some duty, then these reasons must also be important enough for generating remedial duties when the right was overridden by other considerations in certain circumstances. Overriding rights leave a moral remainder that calls for compensation. So reconsider the transition to a net zero emission society and how some policies will require the frustration of certain legitimate expectations. These expectations might be important enough for granting rights, and therefore for constituting grounds for holding others under duties of protecting such expectations. Claiming that this person has valid compensatory claims, one need not show that the state has behaved wrongly by pursuing these policies. It is sufficient to show that when the state frustrates a legitimate expectation, even if it was justified in doing so, the reasons that could justify the existence of a right are also capable of justifying a remedial duty when conflicting considerations of greater weight override the right. So let's turn then to the frustration of legitimate expectations not protected by rights. How should we address cases in which the state frustrates legitimate expectations that reflect merely a legitimate interest of the expectation holder in obtaining possible benefits of a just basic structure that could be realized in the future? Again, we need to distinguish between cases in which it is wrongful for the state to frustrate legitimate expectations and those in which it is not. I talked about the first case before. The wrongful frustration of legitimate expectations always require compensation, and this, I believe, is correct for those protected by rights and those not protected by rights. In cases where it is not wrongful for the state to frustrate legitimate expectations, there are strong reasons for compensation if the state has played a role in its formation. Recall the opera example, where my friend can no longer attend the opera because the state has decided to redirect subsidies to climate policies. In this case, the state of Austria helped to develop my friend's expectation. The state also, in this case as the state, Austria, and this the state here, helped to develop my friend's expectation. The state also bears compensation duties should it frustrate the expectation. When someone has a legitimate expectation that reflects a legitimate interest in obtaining the benefits of the basic structure, in this case cultural goods, the agent responsible for creating such expectations has reasons to provide compensation, even if the frustration of that expectation is not wrongful, unless it has given the expectation holder enough time to adapt to the new circumstances. However, if the state was not responsible for the formation of the expectation that reflects only a legitimate interest in the benefits of the basic structure, and by non-wrongful means frustrates it, the state is not obliged to provide compensation. Next, consider the following example adapted from Alexander Brown. A society has a system of racial segregation in housing. A white couple buys a plot of land in an area destined by current law for whites and applies to the relevant administrative office for permission to build their house. As they are a white couple, the administration approves their request, and the couple starts constructing their house. Suppose the system of racial segregation in housing is abolished and replaced by a system under which the couple can continue building their house or living in the neighborhood, but they no longer live in a whites-only area. People of different ethnicities and of different skin colors will also live in that neighborhood. Is this couple's expectation legitimate? When the state contributes to the development of an expectation merely through a legal permission to perform a certain activity, the state is not fully responsible for the creation of the expectation, since the expectation holder can decide whether or not to make use of that permission. Therefore, the role of the expectation holder in relying on an expectation generated in this context should also be assessed. The role is relevant to know if the state has a moral duty to pay compensation for frustrating it. If the expectation reflects a legal permission only, even if the administration is partially responsible for the creation of the expectation holders are doing something wrong if they rely on an expectation created in a way that is not in accordance with the justice-based criteria of the complex justice view. When this is the case, the state should not pay compensation to the expectation holder when the expectation is frustrated. The case of the white couple wanting to live in a whites-only area fits this description. The couple's expectation does not have the proper connection to justice. Thus, it cannot be legitimate. The expectation of living in a gated whites-only community clearly violates the reasonability constraint of the complex justice view, even if arguably this expectation may satisfy the consistency constraint and the universalization constraint. According to the reasonability constraint, expectations can be legitimate if they are compatible with generally accepted moral principles. Racist principles, and in particular those that assert that only people of a certain skin color can live in a certain area, for that reason cannot be regarded as uncontroversial or as a generally accepted moral view. Therefore, the whites couple's expectation cannot be considered legitimate. The white couple did something wrong in relying on that expectation, even if the administration is partially responsible for its creation. Even if the administration allowed these people to live in a gated white-only community, this couple is not legally obligated to do so. In these circumstances, the reasons for the state to compensate the expectation holders for frustrating expectation that the state was at least partially responsible for creating are cancelled by the fact that the expectation holders have done something wrong by relying on it. When expectations are formed in the sense of legal permissions and the expectation cannot be understood as compatible with the justice-based requirements of the complex justice view and is therefore not legitimate, no compensation has to be paid, even if the administration is at least partially responsible for both creating and frustrating that expectation. So, let's sum up. I've argued, as you find in the first row, that the frustration of legitimate expectations protected by rights always calls for compensatory measures. Cases in which this kind of expectation has not been wrongfully frustrated also call for compensatory measures. This is regardless of the responsibility of the state co-developing them. As for the legitimate expectations that merely reflect a legitimate interest of the expectation holder that you find in the second row, compensation should also be provided if the frustration of the expectation is wrongful. However, in cases in which the state frustrates these kinds of expectations by non-wrongful means, the duty to compensate the expectation holder exists only when the state was at least partially responsible for its development. In the case of expectations that cannot be considered legitimate, this is the third row, the state must only compensate the expectation holder for the frustration when it has wrongfully frustrated the expectation. When the state is partially responsible for creating the expectation, an expectation that cannot be considered legitimate, the fact that the expectation holder has done something wrong by relying on that expectation invalidates the reason for compensation for its non-wrongful frustration. No compensation should be provided when the state causes a non-wrongful frustration of expectations that are not legitimate and in which the state had no role in its development. So, now we come to the last section, looking at these issues under changing circumstances when the expectation at the later point in time can no longer be considered legitimate. So these are cases in which changes in circumstances diminish the connection between legitimate expectations and justice. So consider some expectations of emitting greenhouse gas emissions generated at a certain point in time, T1, under conditions of epistemic validity and with the appropriate link to justice. However, then new information obtained at a later point in time, T2, makes it clear that now those expectations no longer have the proper connection to justice. Consider someone who has built her life plan on a career of excessive travel. During the last 2 decades, she has taken at least one long-haul flight a week in her private supersonic jet. However, new information is clearly communicated, and arguably people are no longer justified in acting upon those expectations. So we come now back to our questions. First, given that expectations are no longer legitimate, is the state morally justified in frustrating these expectations? We have here what you saw before, table 1, but I added the row no longer legitimate. And under the segregation case, in which the white couple always had the relevant information to know that the expectation did not have the right connection, we came to the conclusion that the state doesn't have any duty to provide compensation for the frustration. But now this case is different, right? The case of the excessive traveler, because in T1 the expectation did have the right connection to justice. And people were not liable to know that their greenhouse gas emissions were excessive. It is new information which allows people to think that their expectations do not have the right connection to justice. Therefore, unlike the white couple, they have done nothing wrong in relying on that expectation. In such cases, the value of personal autonomy gives people what we call a meta-expectation of pursuing autonomously chosen life plans. This requires the state to guarantee certain conditions so that people can be partly authors of their own lives. However, although this autonomy-based freedom requires the state to provide people with an adequate range of options, its protection is limited. To quote again Joseph Ross, it does not extend to the morally bad and repugnant. The problem we face is that some legitimate expectation counted as an option included within the range that is adequate because it has the proper connection to justice at T1 may no longer be legitimate at T2 because it has lost that connection. If an adequate range of options to pursue an autonomous life does not extend to morally bad and repugnant options, there would seem to be no reason for the state to protect and not to frustrate those expectations that have lost the proper connection to justice at T2. This would be so because the options upon which the expectation in question was formed at T1 are now at T2 considered bad options. However, we need to distinguish, as Ras asserts, quote, between the effect of the elimination of an option of those already committed to it and its effects on others. End of quote. For these others at T2, those who hadn't developed this expectation, the state no longer has the duty to protect the option upon which these people can develop new expectations of the kind. However, when a person is committed to a certain life plan because they have chosen some option that was considered good at T1 and that option is no longer good at T2 due to circumstances beyond their control, then that person should be given some time to adapt his life plan to the new circumstances. Even if the expectation of emitting greenhouse gases to the same extent at T1 is not legitimate at T2, according to the meta-expectation of pursuing autonomously chosen life plans, people should have sufficient time to adapt their life plans so that their autonomy is not extremely disrupted. During this time, the expectation holder should be granted roughly the same protection regarding the conditions under which the state is justified in frustrating the expectations as when the expectation was legitimate. So, let's consider the second question, namely whether the frustration of previously but no longer legitimate expectation needs to be compensated. Consider the following example. This is an example that Alexander Brown introduced. The prosecutor's office informs the victim of a hate crime, Mr. Singh, that they will prosecute the only suspect, Mr. Y. The prosecutor's office provides Mr. Singh specific dates for the hearing so that he may exercise his right to be present in the courtroom at the trial. Consequently, Mr. Singh, who earns the minimum wage, buys non-refundable train tickets and hotel accommodation for the only purpose of attending the hearings. However, a few days before the hearing, the prosecution office obtains new information and reviews the evidence against Mr. Y. They conclude that they have insufficient evidence to prove that Mr. Singh was attacked by Mr. Y. They drop the charges against Mr. Y and inform Mr. Singh of this decision, frustrating Mr. Singh's expectation. Furthermore, since the train tickets and hotel accommodation booked by Mr. Singh are non-refundable, there's nothing he can do to recover the expenses. I'd like to argue that Mr. Singh should be compensated for those losses. This is not because the frustrated expectations of Mr. Singh were legitimate. At T2 they are not. Instead, compensation is owed because first, the prosecution office was at least partially responsible for creating Mr. Singh's expectation. Second, because Mr. Singh did nothing wrong in relying on an expectation that was both epistemically valid and, until circumstances changed, had the proper connection to justice. So that you find here, right? Again, this is the table 2, but now I added the no longer legitimate concerning whether compensation is owed, and the claim is that compensation is owed to Mr. Singh under these two conditions. State is partially responsible and Singh did not do anything wrong. And that's different from the excessive traveler, or arguably it's different from the excessive traveler. Okay, so come to my conclusion. I discussed how legitimate expectations should be treated during transition processes. Legitimate expectations is the idea, reflect legitimate interests in receiving the benefits of the basic structure. How should they be treated during transition processes? And I discussed this addressing two questions. The first question, is the state morally justified in frustrating expectations? Legitimate expectations protected by rights can only be justifiably frustrated when doing so is necessary to arrive at a just society. But the range of cases in which it is permissible to frustrate legitimate expectations that reflect only a legitimate interest in receiving the benefits of the basic structure is wider. Their frustration can also be justified when doing so is not necessary to arrive at a just society, provided an adequate range of alternative options of relevantly similar quality is available to the expectation holder. Then I addressed a second question, namely, should the expectation holders be compensated for the frustration of the expectations? The frustration of legitimate expectations protected by rights should always be compensated, was the first claim I advanced. However, with respect to legitimate expectations that are not protected by rights, the duty to compensate the expectation holder, if it exists, is owed mainly to the responsibility for its development, the responsibility of state agents to have allowed its development. And then coming to the changed circumstances and no longer legitimate expectations, should they be compensated? Should those who hold such expectations be compensated in T2 when the expectation is no longer legitimate? When someone is committed to a certain life plan based on an expectation that was legitimate at T1 but no longer legitimate at T2, namely owing to changed circumstances. The value of personal autonomy gives people a meta expectation to have a certain time to adapt their life plan to the new circumstances. The frustration of those expectations have lost the proper connection to justice, but may still call for compensatory measures when the agent responsible for creating the expectation frustrates it and the expectation holder did nothing wrong in relying on it. So thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to your questions. This I actually found in the Museum of Photography in the bookshop, and I hope you are not too disappointed to raise your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're moving into the question and answer period, which will be recorded the first half hour. And as usual, we will use the chat function for you that are online. So you write your question in the chat, and for you here, you put up your hand, and we also allow for follow-up questions, a finger if you're here, or just write follow-up in the chat. And I think we quite a lot of questions. I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question because it's kind of questions of clarifications for those like me. So there's like 3-4 small questions. You talked about minimizing the frustration of those that have this kind of expectations. And I wonder if you could tell us more about that. Are you minimizing the total frustration, but you also talked about giving priority to some people, so maybe you want to minimize it in some other way, giving priority to the worst off or something like that. So would like to hear more about that. Then you also said that this kind of frustration, they're just okay if it's a means to achieving a just society. And I thought that was sounded a bit strong, because maybe the options are just achieving more or less just society, and can't we be allowed then, if you go for the option that is getting the closest to just society, can't we then be allowed to do these frustrations? Then I wondered, in most kind of legal contract, you have some kind of force majeure, that if something happens that is in some sense hard to foresee or unavoidable catastrophe of some size, then all this kind of liability disappears. I mean, you're not liable to fulfill if you don't fulfill the contract. That also have sometimes played a role in theories of justice. Nozick famously said that if there's a catastrophe, all these kind of rights goes out of the window, and you should just kind of maximize well-being or something like that. And I wonder, isn't it possible to look at climate change as some kind of force majeure, or that it will develop into that, and then all these discussions in one way becomes redundant, because it's going to be a kind of force majeure situation. I mean, I think it also connects to the idea, can the state have legitimate expectations that are frustrated, and therefore the state doesn't owe any kind of compensation or anything like that, because they couldn't expect this to happen, like in a war situation.
Yeah, great. So on the last question, I just assume that we are not in that situation, right? We are not in this situation of catastrophe where we cannot rely on considerations of justice or normative considerations for making these choices, normative considerations, as they have been developed within for the purpose of organizing societies under conditions that are conducive to realizing justice. So that's an assumption that I'm making. Clearly, if we were to make the assumption that this is a situation of catastrophe, those considerations would lose force. So I'm with you on that. I'm also with you on, obviously, the goal that is being pursued, namely in this case transformation to net zero, being just an element of what might be considered a just outcome, but in my understanding, a necessary element if you want to fulfill certain, namely minimal conditions of justice, in particular with respect to future people and the protection of their basic rights. So yes, there can be more or less just society, but when it comes to achieving what can be considered a presupposition for having a just society, I think these kind of considerations do apply. So, and I do talk about minimizing the frustration of expectations, and you ask me, well, what's the substantive account of how to assess the minimization of the frustrations? My preferred view is a sufficiency view that has priority below and above the threshold, but this would take us far into different matters than the ones I addressed here. So it would be an aggregative view, but an aggregative view that does work with.
I kind of follow up that. Couldn't that also be regulated by some kind of legitimate expectations? Namely that the citizens have some legitimate expectation of how you're going to do this, the minimizing of the frustrations. So it's not really actually, it's going to be another kind of question about that.
Sure. So you could talk about legitimate expectations also in terms of how the state should go about fulfilling or frustrating expectations, and then the question is what kind of claims people have to a certain way of the state going about this. But here the idea is that you can have a procedure, a political procedure in place that is constrained by minimal conditions of justice that are widely accepted, that also inform the reasonability constraint of the complex justice view when it comes to the validity of legitimate expectations. And the procedure, when it then is carried out, is leading to an outcome that, for the purposes of this society in which the procedure is being carried out, is considered to be the just outcome. So this is, this is the kind of answer that I would want to give to that.
Thank you very much. So then I can open up the floor, and Julia, you're going to get a microphone too.
Hi, thank you. That was very interesting. I have a question about one of the cases that you consider to be a case of wrongful frustration that always requires compensation, namely those cases in which the expectation holder is not given enough time to adapt to a new circumstance. And I was wondering how we should understand this notion of enough time to adapt. So it seems to me that different expectation holders might require different amounts of time to adapt to certain new circumstances, even if the circumstances are the same. So this seems to me an important challenge in the transition to a net zero society, for example. So some expectation holders might need a lot more time than the majority, others might need a lot more time than what is actually possible to grant them. Perhaps the transition is just very pressing. So my question is just whose time requirements or expectations with respect to time for adapting to a transition should we use as a reference for determining whether something constitutes a case of wrongful frustration of legitimate expectations due to not having enough time to adapting?
Yeah. So I thank you for the question. It's again a very interesting and very good question, and I don't have an answer to that. But let me see whether I can make at least sense of the question. So what we would want to distinguish, I think, is in these cases where we have changed circumstances, a period of adaptation and then a period after adaptation. And for the period after adaptation, it is clear that nothing is owed to those who held these expectations when they were legitimate, namely in T1, when these conditions held that allowed people to have these expectations and consider them to be valid and have the proper connection to justice. So your question concerns the adaptation period and whether we can think of the adaptation period as one for all who hold a certain expectation, or whether we need to say that some people should be granted a longer period than others. And, you know, in principle, I can see many reasons why one would want to be flexible in terms of that. So people are invested more or less into particular projects that are connected to certain expectations that are no longer valid. So for some it will be more difficult to give up these projects or replace these projects, substitute these projects by others. Then of course the conditions under which they can vary and can make it more or less difficult. So it depends on what kind of resources people have to go about this, right? So I can see, as you pointed out, many reasons for thinking about this adaptation period as variable, and necessarily as variable among people if the frustration of the expectation is to be just. But I don't have a good answer to this. One thing I would like to mention, though, is that in the case of the excessive traveler, there is a complication, I think, namely that during this adaptation period, when we say that the excessive traveler may continue with his activities, the person will cause harm. And the question is, well, who owes compensation for that harm? So it's clear that for the harm caused in period T1, it's the state who owes compensation for the harm. But in period 2, one could argue that it is shared responsibility to provide compensation. And if you were correct, and you are correct, I think, in your observation that it varies, then it seems that if we have one adaptation period for all, there will be some people who have more responsibility than others for providing compensation for the harm they cause in continuing with this activity, because you could say, well, they could actually give up on these activities earlier at costs similar to those who have a more difficult time to do that. So I do think it does matter, and it should be worked out. Yeah, thank you.
Happy with that? Then we go to Malcolm. You're gonna get a microphone, I hope, if Julie gives it to you.
Okay, there we go. So coming from a social science perspective, so not a philosopher, not a theorist. I was trying to think of the sort of real world implications of this, and I was thinking about fossil fuel companies and expropriating them. So this is a little bit of a follow-up on Gustav's question as well, about information, actually. So Gustav asked the question about the legitimate expectations of the state. And I was thinking, in the case of climate change, fossil fuel companies are the ones we may expropriate, but they're also actors who shaped the world's expectations and basically hid information about climate change. So in the analogy with the mountain cabin is owned by the weather company that withheld information about the storm. So in a sense, if we occupy the weather company's cabin to survive the storm that they didn't tell us about, do we still owe them compensation?
So I didn't address fossil fuel companies and sunk costs, etc. A doctoral student of mine, Rutger Lazou, has worked on this, and there are good articles by Rutger coming out and published. So I recommend this work. What I think when it comes to these to this example, the example will be close to the example of the white couple, especially under the description that you just gave, because according to your description, for them to rely on that expectation that they will be able to continue, extract these resources and make benefit out of that, they act wrongly, especially by deceiving the public on the implications of what they did. So I think it's the example of the white couple, and then what we're having is third row, right? And you could then say, frustration is justifiable, and we do not actually owe them something in terms of that frustration, unless, of course, the frustration of the expectations of these companies would be done wrongfully. That's the kind of response that I think my talk suggests. But I think you were also asking a somewhat different question than I answered. Not that you didn't ask the question as you did. So the question is it so helpful to think about these issues in terms of the state developing or making it possible to develop these expectations when there are so many other actors who are also contributing to that? And yeah, I mean, I limited myself to that, and that has to do with a particular perspective on the matter, namely the perspective that what you want to address are questions of normative authority and legitimate decision making, and ideally speaking, then the companies and what they do, their behavior is regulated within that basic structure. So they have a different role in also developing and making or contributing to the development of expectations than states have.
Thanks.
You were happy with that. Okay, then we move on to Professor Byqvist.
Thank you so much for that. You have two comments. One is about the ought entails can principle, and the other one is about changing legitimate expectations rather than changing circumstances. So the first question, I guess you might have a pretty easy answer. I just want a clarification, I guess. Namely, you talked about owing compensation, but of course sometimes you cannot compensate the person. Perhaps the person has died, or you don't have the resources to compensate fully. But of course you might still have some remedial duties. So I wasn't sure why you focused so much on compensation. Perhaps compensation is a wide notion here, or something like that. But the second point is something perhaps would like you to say a bit more about, namely cases where you nudge people in certain ways. So they actually start off with certain legitimate expectations that end up with different ones. And you satisfy those different ones, but you didn't satisfy the previous ones. can there be such cases, do you think, on your notion of legitimate circumstances? And if so, what do we do about the past ones? Do we still owe some compensation to the past selves of these people, or should we just go for their legitimate compensations they currently have? Yeah, that's right.
So on the first question, thank you so much for these auto implies can remedial duties being much wider than compensation duties. I didn't talk about this on this previous paper that Santiago and I wrote. We talk about priority rules and fulfilling these compensation duties, and we also talk about these priority rules given that it is likely that not all of these compensation claims can be fulfilled, which is only one aspect of the question that you raised. And then within the compensation discussion, what one usually does then is talk about material compensation and symbolic compensation. And the point then is to identify those claims that one should give priority in terms of material compensation, and others where you think they have less priority and symbolic compensation would suffice. Now, remedial duties might also include different things than are normally categorized under the title symbolic compensation. So you might think that an apology is it doesn't fall into that category, and that's also something that I do think one should consider. And I think it's an important question also because Gustav raised that question also before, because the states do not only have compensatory duties, right? They have other duties too. So you need to weigh these duties, and especially you need to weigh these duties with duties that are forward-looking and concerning the well-being of future people. So I do think that there needs to be lots needs to be said, and these claims are pro tanto claims. Right? Okay, so a second question I haven't really thought about this, so it's great. So the idea is that we have not changing circumstances, but we have changing legitimate expectations. So in T1 we have legitimate expectations, then in T2 we have legitimate expectations. And it happens that the person who held these legitimate expectations in T1 came to change his or her legitimate expectations, his expectations, and adopted these new legitimate expectations. And do we then, if that happens, owe something to the person owing to the fact that the previously legitimate expectations now will not be fulfilled? I would have thought no, right? Because if you rely on this idea that what is at stake here is that people are partly authors of their own lives, and you said nudging, so I assume you are saying the means by which others helped the person to change his expectations was compatible with the autonomy of the person, then all seems to be fine. Don't see that compensation is owed, because this is part of what it means to be an autonomous person, that you change your ideas about how you want to go about your life, and there's nothing I think that others then owe to that person. I would have thought actually, but I need to think more about this. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess one complication is that the nudging, of course, might involve a process that the person is not aware of, right?
Right.
And hasn't even considered.
Sure.
That, right? And
Sure.
So
As soon as
a bit of a behind the back thing, right? So.
right. So yeah, I agree. the more we describe this process as a process that is imposed, that is not compatible with understanding the affected person as an autonomous agent, the more we will need to consider the question whether something is owed to that person. But then I would have thought something is owed to the person owing to him having wrongfully made to change the expectation, and not because he held these expectations when now at T2 he affirms these new expectations and they are legitimate. He affirms these new expectations as his own. So anyway, I mean, I haven't thought about the issue. So
Thank
you.
Very well. So Ori.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. So this is sort of related to Malcolm's question, and I guess you at least partly answered it already. But I'm curious about sort of cases where the state is not involved at all, and in creating legitimate expectations. So maybe this is a potentially, well, this is actually an example that we came up recently. Suppose that as a department we have created legitimate expectations in our students, not protected by the rights, but they're sort of reflecting their legitimate interests, and we are fully responsible for sort of creating this expectation. What wouldn't sort of what you said apply in that sort of circumstance as well, or is there any reason to think that it's completely different when the state is not involved?
I don't think it's completely different when the state is not involved, but I do think that additional questions arise when the state is involved. So, this is the kind of, the kind of examples that you invite me to consider are the examples that are being discussed, at least by Fergus Green, under the title Practice-Based Expectations. And Fergus, who has done a lot to help us understand the idea of expectations, actually argues that one should limit the idea of legitimate expectations to those that can be understood as a reflection of practices. And this is a view that I have been arguing against by introducing this institutional and then the complex justice view. An example like yours is, I think, more complicated than an example that is limited to people and limited to people in their private relations. So an example that I talked about before is people take turns in cooking dinner on Thursday nights, and the other person who doesn't cook is expected to come, right, to join for dinner, and there's no agreement on this, no written agreement, no formal agreement on that. And the question is, well, how do we understand the expectation and what is owed when the expectation is being frustrated? And here I think the justification for why the person who doesn't show for dinner owes something to the person who cooked this time is that there is a practice of keeping implicit promises. Right? That's different from what's going on in these institutional cases. I take it. Right? So the justification is different in these cases, but the questions that I asked can be asked with respect to these cases as well. So under what circumstances may you frustrate the expectation, and what do you owe to the person. And in this case, you're likely to owe an apology. The example of the department is more difficult, I think, because if I understood the example correctly, the department is an institution, right? So it's regulated by rules, and those rules are public rules and so forth. So it's somewhere in between these cases I discussed and the case of the people who take turns in cooking.
So on that point, join me in thanking Lukas for this very interesting
Thank
talk.
you so much for all your questions.
We have some more talks coming up. We have Michael Graz, who's going to talk about measuring equality opportunity. And he's from Stockholm University, the Swedish Institute for Social Research. And then we have Lina Eriksson going to talk about changing social norms. That's October 2nd. She is from Gothenburg. And then we have October 9th. We have Bashir, who is from the Open University of Israel and the Van Leer Institute. He's going to talk about egalitarian binationals for Israel and Palestine. Welcome.